Okay, in this video, I'm just going to do a brief little introduction to genre analysis and then a summary of the reading that was assigned out of Gorman's book, Elements of Biblical Exegesis. So, by genre analysis, we're talking about identifying a specific literary piece under a category of literature that shares similar features of a structure and a purpose. So, we have talked previously about form criticism. So, the use of the word genre sometimes involves looking at a larger piece of literature and classifying that larger piece. So, for instance, we're looking at the New Testament. We will look at the Gospels, and there'll be some discussions about what kind of genre is the Gospel. So, I mean, quite frequently today, genres are seen as examples of ancient bioi. So they are not exactly like what we in Western cultures might think of in terms of a biography. So the conventions that are used in ancient bioi um, may be reflected in the composition of a gospel. Or we have these things called the Pauline letters, or some might refer to them as epistles. So there's sometimes a distinction between what a letter is and what an epistle, which might be more formal than a letter. So, and then within these genres, there are other forms. So, genre analysis is looking more at the larger piece of the work of a passage. So, some genres said are larger literary units. So, we talked about epistles, the biois. So, you can have a law book, and it is filled with lots of laws in them. So each law is like a form, but a law book, a collection of laws could be a genre. A work could be a narrative in its scope, and of course, it has narrative forms within them. You can have a book that we call them wisdom literature. So that puts them in kind of a category in terms of its theme, but each piece of wisdom literature might take on a different genre. So, for instance, the book of Job might be a different genre than, say, the book of Proverbs, but both are in kind of the wisdom literature, but they have different genres. Same thing with prophecy or an apocalypse. So, an apocalypse is a type of literature that has a lot of features. Oftentimes they get confused with prophecy, and it's very important to be able to distinguish between the kinds of genres that you are looking at. So some are smaller units. So again, this is very similar to forms. So we talked in a previous video about different kinds of forms, sayings, parables, household codes, and these can also be described as genres. So there's a little bit of overlap in how people are using this language. So each genre does have its unique features, and these features then affect the way in which it can be properly exegeted. So if you're dealing with a passage of scripture and you make a judgment about its genre or its form, and then you begin to interpret it along that line, you may come out with an interpretation quite different than what the author intended. So, if you see, for instance, Jesus' teaching in Matthew 18 about divorce and remarriage, if you read that teaching as if Jesus is making some kind of legal pronouncement, and you're treating it like it's a declaration of law, then you are going to interpret along that line. But if you see this more as prophetic speech, and then there are characteristics of prophetic speech, and you understand it as some kind of prophetic engagement, you're going to interpret it along those lines, and you end up with quite different conclusions. Same thing with the difference between prophecy and apocalyptic literature. So prophecy very oftentimes has this element of a conditional foretelling of events to occur. But apocalyptic literature often uses uh, prophetic forms to talk about past events. So sometimes if you're reading an apocalyptic work and you think you're looking at a prophetic work, then you may make judgments about what this text is telling you. It's not really telling you about what's going to happen in the future. It's really giving you a heavenly perspective from the author's view, the heavenly perspective of why things happen the way that they did in the past. So the book of Daniel is a good illustration of an apocalyptic literature. So there is material in there that's cast in the form of prophecy, but it's really apocalyptic use of the prophetic form to talk about things that have already occurred in the life of the author of the work. So that's just a kind of a brief introduction to genre analysis, and so you do also have this form criticism, and there's this overlap here between these two. All right, I want to now go into kind of a summary of some aspects of the formal analysis in the assigned reading out of Gorman's book that you had. So a couple of things here to note. So the one thing that Gorman tells readers is he goes through the importance of understanding the different kinds of genres or the different kinds of forms, and how we use these forms um, throughout life in all kinds of different ways, and we learn how to interpret them. So if you are reading something that is fiction, then you don't treat it as if you're reading history. If you go to a movie, watch a film, and you know that this is make believe, you're not watching real life as it is actually occurring. So, but if you've got cameras on the scene and you're seeing something, you expect that what you are being shown is actually what is really happening, that this wasn't created in a studio to make it look as if it was live. So there's all these expectations that one has when they engage with the genre. So too, when you're engaging with biblical material, there's a question that Gorman thinks is really the first question to ask, and that is you have to make the decision, is this material that you're reading prose? That's just a typical form of expression or conveying information, which is much more kind of straightforward. Poetry, as most people are familiar with, has other kind of conventions. It uses hyperbole. It uses metaphors. Now, you can have hyperbole and metaphors in prose as well, but poetry sets things in some kind of rhythm. It may not be necessarily in the form of rhyme, as if every word kind of rhymes. When roses are red, violets are blue, as we might think of some poetic work, or maybe think of a song that's popular to you. But poetry is set in some type of restricted structure that has a rhythm to it. And so it is important to determine whether or not you are looking at something that is prose or poetry, and that you are going to interpret it along those lines. So one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to make theological assertions as if things are this way or this is the truth as is, if it's based solely on reading a piece of poetry as if it is prose. So you want to be careful to appreciate poetic language. So, for instance, talking about Jesus as the lamb that was slain. We're not talking about an actual a lamb, nor are we talking about slain in some sense of using a sword and severing its head. So that's poetic language, face of God. There's lots of them. Jesus has this saying in Matthew's gospel about do not throw, you know, um, your pearls before swine. Well, he's not really talking about actual pigs, and he's not talking about actual pearls, and he doesn't really have in mind someone throwing something. So it is poetic language that is intended to convey some kind of idea. And so you need to do that. And you don't want to make, as I said, these theological assertions. So one of the ones I think we have to be careful with is when we see hymns in the, especially in the New Testament, these hymns are constructed and they're tightly woven and they're compacted with lots of information, sometimes very important information. But you've got to make sure that you don't base a theological assertion if that information is only found in that piece of poetry. So, for instance, we have in John's Gospel, we have the prologue. And the prologue has some of this rich poetic language. And so, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word, was with God, and the Word was God. So, this language here is intended to evoke certain ideas or thoughts. It is not meant to be read like prose. So, whatever theological assertions is a person wants to make, say about Jesus, they need to appreciate that this is poetry and not press the language for more than what it bears. So I will just leave it at that. So another question he asks us to think about is how many forms are used in a passage that you're going to exegete, and what are those forms? And so in most pieces of biblical literature, you're going to have a lot of different forms. So you're going to have narratives, or you can have parables, or you can have sayings, you can have hymns, you can have what we call a diatribe. You can have lots of different kinds of material. And so you want to be able to see what different forms are there, and then note what they are and what kind of forms that they are. Another question to look at is how are my passage and the book my passage is in organized? So a biblical text is an artistic work, and just like any kind of writing experience oftentimes is, it's just not simply a mindless collection of materials. Someone thought about putting things together, and they usually, when they think about putting things together, they're following different kinds of conventions that existed at that time. So the job of the exegete, to try and figure out what the author was intending to say, needs to appreciate the way in which the author has organized the material. So anyway, when you're doing your passage, so sometimes that's going to be quite a short piece of material, and it's quite easy to organize a passage. Simply, you have your Bible open, you're looking at your number of your verses that you have, and you're just basically kind of summarizing briefly with just a couple of words each idea or thought for each sentence. Now, it may not just be one verse, because sometimes some verses, a sentence might go into more than one verse. So you look for the sentences and you try to understand in what a sentence is saying or what it seems to be about. And then you look at another sentence and you see what that is about. Now, if two sentences are really about the same topic or the same exact issue, then you keep them together. and you move on to when a new topic or a new subject or a new point is made. So that's quite easy to do. You just look at your passage and you observe. Now, when it gets to the book, that takes a lot more work, especially depending upon the length of the book. I mean, if you had a book like the Third John, that's quite easy to do. Or if you had something like Philemon, that's quite easy to look at. That wouldn't take that much time to look at the organization. But if you've got something like the book of Romans, or you've got book of Joshua, or you've got book of Daniel, or you've got something like John's Gospel, you've got these larger ones, my recommendation is to consult an academic commentary that can provide an outline for your book. And you might want to consult several because there are different commentators that see the organization of a book in different ways. And how they understand the organization of that book affects what they think the author is trying to do overall. And so that may be helpful as you think about your particular passage and how it fits into the overall purpose of the author. So consult academic commentaries. Another question is to look at what structural patterns exist in and around my passage. And so you may want to look then at page 26, page 96 and 97. And so here, what you're trying to do is look for structural clues. So you're seeing, these patterns that are at play. It really begins on page 97 and follows on from there. So you're going to be looking for things like repetitions of words. So that would be a good thing. You can just take, if you have a Bible, or can print out a copy of your text. Look for words, major words, significant words, not words like prepositions necessarily, or the word and. But if there are major words, check those out. Or if you can see major ideas are being repeated, you would note that. Sometimes there are contrasts, so you want to see, okay, at this point we have this material, and here we have this kind of contrasting idea or contrasting thought. Or sometimes it may be some kind of parallelism that is taking place. It's the same idea but expressed in a different way. Sandwich structures refers to when an author might introduce something, might introduce a story, a narrative, and then breaks from that, talks about something else, and then comes back to that same topic or subject or narrative. This is particularly thought oftentimes with Mark's Gospel. We talk about Mark and sandwiches, so he does this a lot of times with his narrative, where he'll introduce Jesus doing something, he breaks it off, something else is brought in, and then he comes back and finishes up about healing a person, or he may talk about some kind of judgment. So these are, we call Mark and sandwiches. So that's a particular structural pattern. Chiasmus is a very popular structural pattern. We find it in lots of different places, and Gorman gives you illustrations of these different kinds of chiasms. So he gives an example from Psalm 51, and you can see as well from that there are bigger extensions of the chiasmus in different places. So he gives a really interesting one on page 100, coming out of Romans chapter 5. It's this kind of A, B, C, B prime, A prime model. And when you see these kinds of models, whatever is in the C position, that middle position, that is the significant. That's the major point. So if you do have a chiastic structure, it really is important, especially for preaching, to be able to find out what that C is, because that means if you were to preach and you wanted to preach the same message or what the author was intending to say, their major point to your congregation, then you would want to know what that C is, because that would be the key point to get across in your message. So a little bit then about chiasms as part of the kind of the structural pattern. You'll also notice that there are structural patterns in letters or epistles. So there are sometimes what we call rhetorical analysis that are done. And so he lists what some of these are. They particularly use, since in the ancient world there were rhetorical handbooks, and they instructed people about how to organize material in order to persuade. We see in Paul's letters, for instance, people looking at how Paul may have organized his letters or his epistles in line with some of these ancient conventions. So you have generally an introduction of the speaker or the topic, the exordium, kind of a narration of relevant events, the narratio, some kind of thesis or propositio. So these Latin terms are used to describe these different elements of a letter or an epistle. And so sometimes this is what Paul is doing. Counter arguments, in other words, you pose what a person might say. What shall we say then? Shall we sin that grace may abound? So you put forward what your opponent might say, and then you give your counter argument to that. So, and oftentimes when authors are writing to persuade, they make appeals to different things that motivate people to act in certain ways. So they might appeal to reason. So they ask them, what's reasonable, what they think makes sense. Or they might appeal to emotions. In other words, they might call for them to have sympathy, or they might call for them to have concern or character. Paul can shame the Galatians, who has bewitched you. So this kind of accusation that is made is addressing their character. You have become, deceived, and so you don't want to be deceived. You want to be people who think correctly. So he challenges them. So we look as well for things that are going on to indicate something of the letter's interest and how they're wanting to structure their arguments in order to persuade their reader to come and accept their same view. Also, there are structural patterns in narratives. So we mentioned some of these on page 102, 103. Basically, what we see in narratives is there's this kind of rising action and falling action. So there's usually some kind of climax, central aspects to this. But I will also say this is something that Gorman doesn't point out is, sometimes the climax in a narrative is not really kind of in the middle, so we don't have a falling action. Sometimes the climax is in what we call a pronouncement or an utterance. I'm thinking here in the Gospels where Jesus might say something. He's engaging in some kind of conflict, and then he gets to say something. And when he says this statement, he has his saying, it ends. And that's because this is an illustration of a pronouncement narrative, a type of narrative, where the focus is really on what it is that Jesus says, not so much on the conflict. So what gets cast as climax might not be central in the story. So some of the miracle stories, healing stories, they may have something of that rise and fall, but not all narratives do. So just to kind of take a look at what is the pattern, how does it unfold? And so in terms of unfolding, we also think about the question of movement. How does a particular move within the passage? So structure and movement are kind of really close together with each other. And so it's easy to get them kind of confused. But in the movement, you're really looking for a change in subject matter, which can be a part of structure as well. But you're trying to see how this author is taking step by step to unfold things. So you're looking for, is the next thing an explanation? Is the next thing that occurs a basis for the logic? Is the next thing indicating some kind of chronology, like using the words next, then, while, but, therefore? kind of interesting aspect in Mark's gospel is Mark likes to connect episodes, narratives, simply with the word and then, and then. And so he is moving you through the narrative of Jesus' ministry by just this kind of quick repetition of one event after the other. So it gives a movement of speed that you're reading something, things happen, and then something immediately happens, and then something immediately happens. So there's this quick movement that is taking place. So you try to look for, what you try to look for is any indication then of when the author is doing something different than what they have said in the previous verse. So how is it moving? So anyway, that's kind of a brief review of what you will find as you are reading Gorman and some of the things to just kind of watch out for, take in, and what might be helpful as you're going to work on your formal analysis of your passage.